But I'm really glad to say that already from book sales and ticket sales, we've raised £1,500 for this year's bursaries appeal, which is aiming to fund 5 new bursaries for next year. So thank you so much for coming. I'm delighted to introduce Paul Goldsmith, Paul over there, who has been teaching politics and economics here at Latymer for 7 years and is a head of year in the middle school. He's also a keen political commentator and a blogger. And Jason Farrell, senior political correspondent at Sky News, with over 15 years' experience in broadcast journalism. And we're thrilled to have both him and Paul with us today to tell us how to lose a referendum. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming this evening. I am Paul Goldsmith, this is Jason Farrell, and I want to start off by saying a little bit about the Latymer Foundation, what it means to me. I'm here because my parents were able to give me the best education money could buy, and the reason they could do that was because they had scholarships to their school as well. And through luck of birth, I was able to put myself in a position to be here. Bursaries make a huge difference, and that's why it means a lot. Now, the reason we're actually here is because of a question I was asked the 24th of June 2016 by a Year 12 student who wanted to know exactly why Britain had voted leave and why people hadn't predicted it. And I decided to make it my summer project, one of these things that teachers do. They have a little summer reading project to try and give a better answer than I felt I could give at the time. I read a lot during the campaign, but I felt that the results seemed more inevitable than I'd realized. After about a month, I'd come to the conclusion that there would have been a leave vote, whatever happened. And as Jason and I were driving our daughters down to Peppa Pig World in the south of England, we had a debate about this. Now, people always say, well, that's just a whimsical story, it never happened. Well, this is a picture of us on the log flume at Peppa Pig World with our daughters, so it did genuinely happen. I said that I felt that the leave vote was predetermined. It would have happened whenever the referendum was held. Jason had been on the campaign, and he felt that the campaign was really important too. We decided, eventually, to write a book together and managed to get a publishing deal, and here we are. But the thing is, what we wanted to do with the book is to try and make sure that we wrote the best explanation we can of why Brexit happened. And we learnt an enormous amount. And this talk really is about the things that we learnt that we didn't know before. So hopefully you'll all find out something new tonight.
Thank you very much, Paul. So, my other motivation for writing the book was that I'm always telling the first draft of history, and I really wanted to have a crack at telling the second half draft of history as well, which is a bit greedy, I suppose. But what this talk will do is we're going to mix history with the campaign. It won't always be in chronological order. We're going to try and explain how both things fed into each other. The campaign fed into the history of it, the history more fed into the campaign. And the figure you see on the screen at the moment is a man called Dominic Cummings. He was the campaign director of Vote Leave, described by David Cameron as a career psychopath. And many of you may not recognize him, but you will recognize his slogan, "Take back control." That slogan, I just want to talk to you a little bit about how that was developed. In 2014, he was commissioned by Matthew Elliott, who would eventually become chief executive of Vote Leave. And he was asked to look at attitudes of people, how they felt about the EU. And I want to read you some of the things he did, because he got focus groups of people around the country. And I'll just read you some of the comments that he got from people from those focus groups. We got hold of this report for our book. A man in Warwickshire: "If Cameron's so weak that he can't get control of immigration, then I'm voting out." A woman in Thurrock: "How much money are we spending? Millions? Billions? Tens of billions?" A woman in Hendon: "If we leave the EU, we'll save a fortune, and we can spend that on the NHS." A man in Thurrock: We've lost control because of Europe. Vote Leave slogans that were developed from this report that became the blueprint for their campaign in 2014, they were developed from people. They weren't developed from strategists. They weren't developed by politicians or advertising gurus. They came out of the mouths of people, and that's what made them so potent. In that report, the word control was mentioned 37 times. It was only 19 pages long. Take back control was mentioned 5 times. And I just want to read you one of the conclusions from, in fact, before I do that, I just want to make one other point. That report was published in June 2014. So it was 18 months before the campaign even started. It was months before the actual Remain campaign had even started putting their campaign together. These guys were massively on it, and the Remain campaign wasn't. And one of the conclusions from Cummings, he says, in a referendum, remember as well, we hadn't even had the general election by this stage. In a referendum, it would be important for the out campaign not to take specific positions on any issues, as this would only split the campaign. Instead, the out campaign should simply say, whether you think X or Y about Z, the most important thing is we take back control of Z.
While Jason was gallivanting around having lunch with cool people, I was ensconced in the British Library and Kew Archives and other places, researching the history of Britain's relationship with the EU. And one of the first things I found out was the moment we lost control. And we lost control, really, just after the Second World War, when we decided not to take part in the creation of the European community. The man on the left of your screen as you look is a man called Jean Monnet. Jean Monnet was a career civil servant. He came over to this country in the Second World War. He was a French civil servant, worked for the government, went back to France. He was never a minister or anything like that. But he's really the godfather of the European Union as we know it now. Jean Monnet had a task, a problem that he was trying to solve, with encouragement from the United States in the shape of Dean Acheson, who was the Secretary of State at the time in the late 40s. The United States had committed to a Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. They were giving us money, and Acheson was the custodian of that. But part of that was a need for Europe to rebuild together and to be able to live without Americans doing everything for them. In order to do that, they realized very quickly, in the face of increasing Soviet encroachment, which by 1948 was becoming and turning into the Cold War, they needed to rebuild Germany. But they had to rebuild Germany in a way that made them feel safe. And they were trying to work out how to do that. Now, France at the time occupied the Ruhr region, coal, steel, a really important industrial area of Germany. And Monnet was on a walking holiday in the Alps. Now, as we know, all great ideas in politics happen in walking holidays. This is a particularly good idea. What if, he thought, what we do is we pull together coal and steel production, and we have a higher authority, a supranational authority, a primary legislature that can actually pull together these resources and make sure that everybody works together. Let's not just have France and Germany, let's have lots of other countries working together. Because if we could do that, then Germany could rearm and we would know what they're making. Coal is energy. Steel can be used for cars and buildings, but also arms. When he came back from his holiday, he made a tour of French government trying to find someone to take this on. And he eventually found Robert Schuman. Robert Schuman is the French foreign minister. One of the things that is interesting about what Monnet did is that the most famous piece of paper in the creation of the European coal and steel community, as it became, is called the Schuman Declaration. Monnet wasn't bothered about whether things were named after him. 9th of May, 1950, is called Schuman Day. The Schuman Declaration created the European coal and steel community, and in it were some really, really important words. This cooperation between France and Germany will make war between them materially impossible. Bear in mind, he was saying this after a period of time where every generation of Frenchmen had seen their country invaded by Germany. Nobody thought this was possible, and it is one of the most amazing achievements of the European community as it became. Now, 9th of May 1950 was when the Schuman Declaration was made. It was at a press conference in Paris. And then they went to Britain to try and get Britain to get involved. They hadn't involved Britain, not even America, in the creation of this. Dean Acheson was told on the morning of the press conference. So Ernest Bevin, who was the foreign minister for the Labour Party at the time that were in charge, was very angry. And he wouldn't speak to Monnet, but some civil servants would. And Monnet tried to persuade these civil servants to persuade their political masters to join. And the civil servants said, okay, fine, but this idea of a supranational authority doesn't really work for us. You see, we're a parliamentary sovereignty. Our parliament is sovereign. People vote for our laws, and we make them, and parliament can do what it wants. And it sounds like this supranational authority can do things like telling a coal mine to cease production or mothballing a steel plant. That's not going to work. There are 3 reasons why Britain decided to ignore this invitation. Reason 1, we won the war. We weren't fascist or invaded by fascists. We won the war. There was no reason, therefore, to change our economic and political arrangements. Number 2 was that we still had the 3 circles of foreign policy: Commonwealth trade and our relationship with the former empire, the United States special relationship, yes, even then, and Europe as well. And so for about a month, discussions went on, because the third problem was that Labour government at the time was the astonishing Labour government of 1945 to 1951. They created a new Jerusalem, the NHS, the welfare state, full employment. It requires control by a government. And so they just weren't that interested. And this is why, when Monnet and Schuman said to Britain, you've got 1 day, June the 1st, 1950, you've got 1 day to decide whether you're joining the negotiations or we're going to continue. Attlee was away on holiday. Stafford Cripps, the Chancellor, away on holiday. Ernest Bevin, the Foreign Secretary, in hospital. Now, thankfully, Herbert Morrison, Peter Mandelson's grandfather, was not away. He was the Deputy Prime Minister. And so Edwin Plowden from the Foreign Office had to track him down to try and get an answer. Being Herbert Morrison, Peter Mandelson's grandfather, he was at the Ivy, which is in the West End. And so Plowden tracked him down in the Ivy, and they went out the back into a corridor with some chairs, and Plowden said, so what's the answer? And Morrison shook his head and said, it's just no good. The Durham miners will never wear it. And so we didn't join the European coal and steel community. We missed the boat on that. Then we missed the tanker of the European community. You see, the ECSC, as it was, worked. They actually got 4 other countries to join: Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Italy. And they quite enjoyed working with each other, and they could see it was working. So eventually they started to think about, how can we broaden this? They thought about a European army, but that didn't necessarily work. They were worried about generals in different languages trying to explain things to people. Winston Churchill had taken over in 1951, and even though he was interested in a united Europe, he'd always kind of said, you should unite, but we might not go there with you. In about 1954, a man called J.W. Bayen, the Foreign Secretary of the Netherlands, said, why don't we extend this to as much production as possible? Why don't we create a European community, a customs union, no tariffs between the members, an external tariff to people outside? Why don't we see what can be done? So they created a committee under a man named Paul-Henri Spaak, the Spaak Committee, and they were going to meet in Brussels. And they said, let's invite Britain, no conditions, to explore what's possible. So the invite came. Bayen went to London and said to Anthony Eden, who was Prime Minister by the time, Rab Butler, the Chancellor, and Harold Macmillan, who was Foreign Minister, come and join us. No conditions. To be honest, Eden didn't think it would work. Eden was still interested in the Commonwealth, not really in Europe. Butler was even less impressed. He said we should send a delegate. But Macmillan said, I'm a little bit worried about this. We might be able to shape this in our interest. Surely we should at least send a representative. You see, if you send a politician, they can make decisions on your behalf. If you just send a representative, all they can really do is listen. But Macmillan knew he wasn't going to get a minister sent, and so instead they sent this man, Russell Bretherton. There is one picture of him in existence. There's one interview of him in existence, 1982 in a Radio 2 program. He is a career civil servant. Everything you need to know about why we didn't join and what Britain was like at the time, you can learn by the fact that Russell Bretherton was sent to a meeting of foreign ministers in Brussels to discuss the opening of the European community with strict instructions not to agree to anything. On the very first day, and they were surprised to see him there, he realized what the European community was. He was a trade economist. He taught at Oxford, he taught Harold Wilson at Oxford, then he went to the Board of Trade. He was a trade economist, and he was sent there because they thought it was about trade. He started writing home these missives. He had to wait every 4 days for the diplomatic bag to come with instructions, and then he would be sending messages home. It wasn't like he could Snapchat. What he really wanted to say was, these guys are serious, and this is political. This isn't economic. We should be part of this. And he was ignored. Now, Russell Bretherton, in his interviews in 1982, is quite amusing about the foreign ministers he was with. One of my favorite lines he came up with was, "We were supposed to work throughout the summer. But then on about the beginning of August, the others realized that they were European, and suddenly a daughter was getting married or a grandmother was ill. So we adjourned till September." Now, Russell Bretherton went back to London, and he took Paul Henry Spack back with him because Spack was very frustrated at the presence of Bretherton. And Spack went to meet with Rab Butler, and he decided what he would do was he would try and persuade Butler to buy into the vision of Europe. And as he came out of this meeting, Robert Rothschild, who was Spack's assistant, described what happened at this meeting. He said that as Spack got warmer, Butler got colder. As Spack became more expressive, Butler sunk into himself. And as they came out, Spack said to Rothschild, "You know, he could not have looked more shocked when I appealed to his imagination than if I had taken my trousers off." Bretherton was sent back to these negotiations. Rothschild describes him as a very nice man, but who would used to sit there with arched eyebrows, looking at them like they were naughty schoolboys trying to get away with something. Eventually, Spack decided enough was enough. He asked one more time for Harold Macmillan to come, and Macmillan was told no, and Bretherton was told he was going home. But before he went home, Bretherton read out from a piece of paper. Rothschild reports he read it in as deadpan a voice as possible. "Gentlemen, what you are trying to negotiate will never be negotiated. If it is negotiated, it will never be ratified. And if it is ratified, it will never work. Au revoir, and bonne chance." And he walked out of the room, and the European community was formed without Britain taking any part in it. Freedom of workers, freedom of movement of capital, freedom of movement of goods and services. Russell Bretherton, when he saw the final Treaty of Rome in 1957, thought it was quite an amazing document. Because, of course, civil servants are professional in public and perhaps not so much in private. And he never spoke about it till 1982. And he was disappointed what he was asked to do. The problem with the Treaty of Rome was that it committed everyone to this supranational institution and to these four freedoms. And the Treaty of Rome is what David Cameron tried to unpick when he started his negotiations.
Now, when you're trying to unpick a treaty, what you need is another treaty. And David Cameron thought he was going to get one. And it is really important to understand that when David Cameron went into his negotiations saying he wasn't going to take no for an answer, he thought there was going to be another treaty. And the reason he thought that is because at the time we'd had the Eurozone crisis. And the Eurozone crisis came with various conditions that were put on countries such as Greece to do with repayments and penalties if they didn't repay, and the European Stability Mechanism was set up. And all of this looked like it was going to need a treaty. And that would give David Cameron a bit of bargaining power. He'd be able to go in there and say, okay, I'm going to have this treaty about the Eurozone. I've got a few conditions here that I want to add for the UK. But the Europeans were a bit clever about this. They didn't want to have another treaty because last time they'd had one, which was the Treaty of Lisbon, there'd been referendums. And the European Union doesn't like referendums because basically sometimes they don't go their way. And this had happened with Lisbon. And they'd had to rehab some of those referendums, and they'd had to sort of work around it. So basically, what David Cameron thought he was going to get in terms of treaty change was not going to happen. I think the second problem with his renegotiation was that he had these 4 baskets of issues that he wanted to discuss. But the key one amongst them that everybody knew was immigration. And it was actually, again, pointed out in this report back in 2014 when people looked at attitudes of people around what needed to be renegotiated. It was quite clearly set out. And again, I'll just read you a little bit of what Cummings had to say. He said, regaining control of immigration and human rights, because people didn't like what happened with Abu Hamza, basically. It said that is the most important thing, that we have an Australian-style point system. It's the strongest argument for changing our relationship with the EU. And he goes on to say, if Cameron and the Conservative Party, they'll have a big problem if they stay in government in 2015. If they do have a negotiation of some sort, but either don't try, or fail to take back control of immigration from the EU, then those swing voters will regard the negotiation as a big failure. And I think it wasn't just that the negotiation was regarded as a big failure and thin gruel as it was described in the Commons, but it also put immigration at the forefront of the whole agenda until February, the months leading up to the campaign, which has obviously ended in June. And it revealed a certain impotence that David Cameron had within Europe. And it allowed other people to set the objectives. So you had, for example, UKIP and the Sun newspaper saying that we should take back complete control of free movement altogether. So we'd end it. You had Boris Johnson saying we need to reform the cap, we need to repatriate our social and employment law. And then you had a group that was set up, and it was set up by the same people who commissioned that report I was just telling you about, called Business for Britain. And what they basically did was they sucked in any business that was potentially Eurosceptic by saying we're going to have a Remain or Reform agenda. So we're going to have a campaign group set up by businesses that will be Remain or Reform. And they tried to basically get these businesses sort of into the departure lounge, if you like, to get them onto the Vote Leave platform. And their basic message that they set out in a big document to David Cameron was that we should go back to purely a free trading arrangement with the EU.
Go back to a free trading relationship with the EU. We have never had a free trading relationship with the EU. It's just not existed. Now, that doesn't mean that Harold Macmillan, who by 1957 was Prime Minister, didn't try. When he saw what the European community was doing, he was a bit worried about how it would affect Britain. So he tried to create an alternative. He wanted to create a free trade area that involved Britain, the 6 members of the European community, and the Commonwealth. And the European community took one look at this and said, you're not having the economic benefits of our union unless you have the political obligations too. So very quickly, Macmillan started to look into other alternatives, and eventually he got to the point where he decided that perhaps he should try and get Britain to join the European community himself. One of the first things he did, a lot of people don't know about, is he went to America to talk to John F. Kennedy about it. And John F. Kennedy and his Secretary of State, George Ball, said to Macmillan, let me give you some advice. We're very happy for you to try and do this, but accept the conditions, get in, and then try and change it from the inside. Because if you try and do anything else, it won't work. Do what France are doing. President Charles de Gaulle was in charge of France, and he was looking after French interests from within. So, for example, Macmillan wanted to have free trade with the Commonwealth. Already, de Gaulle had managed to get some French colonies, such as Senegal, and free trade included in it, because he was in. Macmillan decided not to. What he decided to do instead is to try and negotiate. So he went to Parliament to get permission to negotiate. There was a vote in Parliament. Beforehand, he got some advice from Lord Kilmuir, who was the Lord Chancellor at the time, who was very concerned about the fact that there was to be no discussion at all about sovereignty. He thought that might come back to bite us in the end. So anyway, Macmillan sends Ted Heath, as his representative to Brussels for meeting after meeting after meeting. But de Gaulle is often remembered for his vetoes, saying, no, no. In fact, that's a bit unfair on him, because all de Gaulle said is that you can join the European community when you're European, when you forget about your special relationship with the United States and work with us. When you stop thinking you can have free trade with the Commonwealth and have free trade with us. You're not ready to join unless you're properly European. And Macmillan eventually was told by Heath, you're going to have to go and negotiate with him, because de Gaulle was becoming all-powerful. He'd won a majority in the French Parliament. So Macmillan had 2 sessions negotiating with him. At the end of the second one in Rambouillet in Paris, de Gaulle managed to make Macmillan cry with frustration, because he wasn't changing anything. And Macmillan thought, he was saying to Macmillan, you should be developing nuclear weapons with us, not with the United States. And Macmillan thought he'd double down, went to the United States, got permission to use Polaris missiles for both Britain and France, went back to de Gaulle and says, look what I've got. And de Gaulle got even angrier. And eventually, in January 1963, de Gaulle called a now famous press conference when he said, he issued the first veto of Britain's application to the European community. And that's the first veto. There was a second veto in 1967, before we even got to any negotiations. And then finally, in 1970, our application was to be accepted, 30th of June. Now, Harold Wilson had been involved, the Labour Prime Minister in 1967. Harold Wilson then called a snap election just before our application went in 1970 and managed to lose it. And so Edward Heath, who's the man on the left, was our Prime Minister, the most pro-EU Prime Minister we've ever had. And Edward Heath instructed Con O'Neill, who was the Foreign Office head of the civil servant in the Foreign Office, to lead the negotiations. O'Neill wrote a report about these negotiations, which was buried deep and only released in 2003. And O'Neill described his instructions thus: I was told to swallow it and swallow it whole. The negotiations were accidental and secondary because we were going in whatever happened. Now, what did we have to swallow? I'll tell you what we had to swallow was all the things that had been agreed since 1963, the first veto. In 1964, 2 court cases had gone through the European Community, the European Court of Justice, establishing the European Union and the European Court of Justice as the primary legislature. In 1966, de Gaulle had managed to win a national veto, to veto anything that a country didn't like. In 1969, the Common Agricultural Policy was finalized. France and Italy have an agricultural sector of over 20%. Ours is 3%. And the way that the Common Agricultural Policy was paid for was the EU budget. And the EU budget was paid for in this way. You had 1% of VAT. We didn't even have VAT, we had to create it. And all the tariffs that are collected from all the countries we trade with, which for us was the Commonwealth, for instance, had to be collected and given to Brussels. This was the EU budget. And I'll tell you, another thing they did was the Common Fisheries Policy. Common Fisheries Policy, which pooled all our fish together, even though the countries that were joining were 4/5 of the fish population. That was signed at 9 a.m. on the morning of our application, which means we had to swallow it whole. It's called the Acquis Communautaire, all the agreements. Everything. Common fisheries, agriculture, primary legislature, Parliament would become second, and the EU budget.
And the budget, of course, became one of the most important things in the campaign. This bus I travelled on, and made in Poland, you might be interested to know. The UK Statistics Society, Andrew Dilnot, described this slogan as misleading. It's become one of the most controversial slogans of the campaign, of any campaign. So I just want to talk about it a little bit, where it came from and just how controversial it is and whether it's important. Where it came from, it actually stems back to the No to AV campaign in 2011. A guy called Matthew Elliott, who I've already mentioned, who was the eventually become the chief executive of Vote Leave, ran a campaign against changing the electoral system from first past the post to No to AV. And rather than concentrate on anything to do with the benefits of one system versus the other, what he decided to focus on was the cost of changing the system. The cost of changing the system would include the cost of the referendum that they were currently having. So he added that into the cost. And then he added all the costs of facilitating having a different system. And he came up with a figure of £250 million. And then he said, couldn't we spend that money better on something else? And he came up with a load of campaigns, a load of slogans around spending it on bulletproof vests for soldiers in Iraq, or facilities for doctors in the NHS. And the campaign turned around. People went his way. They supported No to AV. They actually won that by 70%. Now put that together with his coming together with Dominic Cummings in 2014, where they spoke to everybody about what they felt about. Now, you heard some of those quotes earlier. I mentioned about how the money could be better spent. And pretty much all they then needed to do was come up with a figure. So they came up with 350 million. Now, we know about this, don't we? But I will go into it just a little bit. The 20 billion is the annual figure. And when I last looked at the figure, that the amount we were spending, it comes to around about 325 million we actually spend currently at the moment that we send. If you take off the rebate, it's actually 250. And then if you take off the subsidies and the stuff that comes back to agriculture, it comes down to 165 million pounds a week. So on the face of it, that looks like a big fat lie. However, I've gone back through all my interviews with Boris Johnson and people I spoke to about this, and he's always pretty clear that he was talking about controlling the money. He always talks about, well, we can't control the money that goes to scientific research, and we would be able to decide how we spend it. So in his view, the subsidies you could discount and say, well, actually, we're going to control that money, so that still counts into the figure. Then you've got the rebate, and the rebate is, it's not really money that comes back. I mean, it's money that's never really sent. It's a reduction. And that amount of money is not, however, in any treaty. So you could argue that every 7 years we have to negotiate that money, even though we've had it since 1984 when it was negotiated by Margaret Thatcher. You could argue that many people wanted us to get rid of it, and that even if we kept it, we might have to give up other things in order to keep the rebate. So there was a way of saying that this was a potentially credible figure. It was a defendable lie. And in a campaign, that was a very, very potent thing. And I think Matthew Elliott, they both say that without this figure, they wouldn't have won. Without this slogan, they wouldn't have won. I personally think that if they'd have put 170 or 165 million on the bus, maybe it wouldn't have made any difference. It's still a lot of money, right? But actually, the big thing about this is it got the other side talking about it. And almost as many people heard about this figure from the Remain campaign as they did from the Leave campaign, because it was so controversial. And this is what Matthew Elliott had learned all the way back in No to AV, that he got slammed in that original campaign by the Liberal Democrats for the way he had constructed the figure. It worked. It drew attention to itself. And he'd focus tested it, and he knew that people believed it. Now, just compare that to the Remain campaign when they came out with their figure. The Treasury produced a report saying that everyone was going to be £4,300 worse off. Nobody believed it. Far fewer people believed that figure. And the problem the Treasury had was, it just wasn't focus tested. It came out 2 weeks. They only got the figure around about 2 weeks before the beginning of the main campaign. So by the time that figure was out there, they couldn't retract it. Actually, I think a better figure would have been, it's going to make you £80 a week worse off, taking their idea and putting it into a weekly figure. But the problem is that Matthew Elliott, who put this campaign together, he knew his figures were believed, and the Remain campaign didn't, and that was the difference.
Now, Matthew Elliott's an interesting person because one of the things he did was he studied European history. And he studied in particular the referendum in 1975. Now, I'm going to guess some people here voted in that. So I might be telling you something you know. However, one of the things that people often don't understand is why didn't we have a referendum when we joined the European community? Edward Heath said in 1970 that we would not join the European community without the full-throated consent of the British peoples and parliaments. Then, when he ended up in power, and Enoch Powell, who you might know about through what he said about immigration, but was a big sovereignty fan himself, said, why aren't we having a referendum for joining Europe? He said, but it was in our manifesto, and people voted for it. It was also in the Labour manifesto and the Liberal manifesto. There was no way not to vote for it. When we decided to join, we joined with Denmark and Ireland and Norway. And so the 4 countries joined. Denmark had a referendum, voted yes. Ireland had a referendum, voted yes. Norway had a referendum, voted no because of the fish. They're still out. France had a referendum on whether we should join. We didn't have a referendum. Enoch Powell was angry, and the thing people forget about Enoch Powell is just how popular he was with the base on both sides. If we had a presidential system, he might have been president. And one of the things he said to Edward Heath is that there needs to be a referendum on this. The Labour Party, through a lot of shenanigans you can read about in our chapter on this, had ended up promising a referendum. It was Tony Benn's idea. Harold Wilson wanted to stay in the European community. The Labour conference kept on saying, we want to leave without just leave automatically. Wilson said he'd resign. Benn said, why not put it in the manifesto, we'll have a referendum. Jim Callaghan said, Tony's just come up with a lifeboat, we may want to jump in. Little did they know who would jump into that lifeboat with them, because in 1974, Edward Heath had to call a snap election because of the 3-day week and all the chaos in the country. Enoch Powell said to him, we need to have a referendum, and when he refused to put it in, Powell did 2 things. Firstly, he left the Conservative Party and stood as an independent, and then he announced he was going to vote Labour, because they were going to have a referendum. This was really important in terms of turning Conservative seats into Labour seats in the Midlands. And so we ended up with a Labour government, and we ended up with a referendum in 75. It's almost worth not talking about this referendum, because it was so unbalanced. The Yes campaign had 10 times the amount of money of the No campaign. They had all the newspapers behind them. Daily Mail, Daily Express, Telegraph, loved the European community. The Morning Star, Communist Morning Star, and The Spectator were on the No campaign. And there was no mention of political union or monetary union, because they weren't on the cards at the time. Everyone had just floated their currency. And there was barely any mention of sovereignty, apart from in the Yes campaign's leaflet, which said, yes, we might be pooling our sovereignty, but there's still a national veto, so you don't have to worry about things being done to us. Now, I put Margaret Thatcher here for a few reasons. One is that, as we're about to find out, she gave away more sovereignty than probably anyone else. But there's another reason. She didn't lead, even though she was Conservative leader, she didn't lead the Yes campaign. Neither did Harold Wilson. It was left to a popular Conservative and popular Labour politician to lead these campaigns. Matthew Elliott carried around this. This is a picture of the No campaign from a cartoon in the Evening Standard. Enoch Powell, Tony Benn, Michael Foot. Roy Jenkins, who was leading the Yes campaign, said of these people, a vote no would put us back in the old people's home of European economies, and I don't like the look of some of the wardens. Matthew Elliott knew that in order to succeed in the 2016 referendum, he had to persuade a popular, mainstream politician, popular with all different types of voters, to join the Leave campaign. Who might that person be? I'm going to ask Jason to point a fluffy microphone at him.
Aha! Boris Johnson. Yeah, what did Boris Johnson put in Theresa May's tea yesterday, we wonder? How did he sabotage that stage? How did he get that comedian to go and give that P45 to her? He was, we title our chapter on Boris Et tu, Bojo, because he was the guy who everybody was waiting to see which way he would go. Here he is in Cornwall. This is Truro, holding up some asparagus, saying it would taste better if we left the EU, to which Gisela Stewart thought that was tremendously funny. As you can see, I'm sort of slightly worried I've got my hand on her shoulder there. I'm not quite sure, getting a bit close. But that's what it's like with Boris. There's a press scrum. I remember 1 minute there was nothing in that square. It was like nobody was there. And then all of a sudden, this white mop, and everyone's straight to Boris. And that's the stardust of Boris. He's going to, any campaign that he's on, he's going to attract attention. Every media outlet in Cornwall wants to speak to him. He's immediately going to draw attention. So what was his motivation for joining Leave? A lot of people say it was a career decision. And there's evidence around that to suggest that it possibly was. Boris obviously does want to be the next leader of the Conservatives, and he did then. And he possibly thought that if Cameron had lost the general election in 2015, he would be mayor of London, he'd be in a good position, that would be a platform. Once Cameron won, he was going to lose that platform because he was going to have to give up the mayoralship, and then he didn't quite know where he was going to end up. He also knew that David Cameron was going to give up the premiership in 2019, because he'd said that in an interview, so he knew the clock was ticking. And he also knew that Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party, and the problem with that, at the time, he was not seen as a threat. And the Conservatives, if they don't have a threat, they don't need the stardust, they don't need the risk of Boris Johnson. They've got the man with the long-term economic plan. So as long as the long-term economic plan was going to stay on track, George Osborne was going to be the next Prime Minister. I think that was a motivation for Boris Johnson, and travelling around with him through Truro, through the Tory heartlands that they just, well, the Tory marginals that they just swept up from the Liberal Democrats. Here was Boris Johnson going around with a message that he knew the Conservative base accepted, liked. They wanted, most of them, he knew that most of the Conservative base were Eurosceptic. All of this has got to have surely played into his decision. When we got to Exeter, I said to him, I said, Boris, it looks like you've just been on a big tour. You've been on a big tour around all the Conservative areas with a message. It feels like a leadership campaign. You've got the whole press here. Everybody's here looking at you. That would not have happened if you'd have been on the Remain campaign, because most of the focus would have been on David Cameron. And I said, you know, it's looking like the Boris bus. And he said, look, if I had wanted to be the next leader, do you think this is going to go down well with David Cameron? Do you think I'm going to get a good cabinet position because I've done this? He said, you know, my only motivation could have been because I wanted us to leave the European Union. And nobody really questioned that, but I thought about it afterwards, and I thought, there's an assumption in that Cameron's still going to be there at the end of this. And nobody questioned it because nobody actually thought that Vote Leave were going to win. And I'm not even sure that Boris Johnson thought that Vote Leave were going to win, because he kind of made that assumption as well in his answer. And the other thing he said was, and by the way, it's not my bus. And Rob Hutton from Bloomberg turned around to him and said, well, nobody's calling it the Gisela Stewart bus. And indeed, they weren't. And I think the key thing around Boris is that who would they have if they hadn't had Boris Johnson? As Paul says, they needed someone like that. They couldn't have run the campaign with John Redwood or some of the other characters from the old Tory past. It would have been difficult to have Farage run it. So they needed to get Boris Johnson. And one of the key things that, going back to 2014, when they were trying to put the campaign together, they did come up with this idea of Business for Britain, pulling all the businesses together to create a kind of business-led idea. And the way to draw in Boris Johnson, they felt, was to create a campaign that wasn't based around immigration. And although you will notice that the campaign towards the end did become based around immigration and Turkey and 350 million a week, actually, when it started out, Vote Leave wasn't like that. And the whole reason it wasn't like that was to try and attract Conservatives in. And so the campaign itself started based on the thing that mattered most to Boris Johnson. And those are the things I mentioned already. So taking back control of certain laws, such as employment law, taking back control of social laws, and basically sovereignty.
Now, my chapter on the 1975 referendum is called The Immaculate Deception. We met quite a lot of people who voted yes in 75, who voted leave in 2016. My chapter on Margaret Thatcher's part in all this channels a song from the 80s, and it's called Careless Thatcher. Now, this is Jacques Delors, the European Commission president, and he was in place for 10 years. He was the great integrator. He came with lots of wonderful ideas. Margaret Thatcher, when she became prime minister, concentrated most on getting our money back, my money back, handbag notes, let's get this rebate. And she achieved it, 66% of our VAT contributions. It saved us about £80 billion over the last 30-something years. And you might think that was a success. In the process, she managed to irritate everybody. And when Jacques Delors came up with a plan to create a proper single market, not just no tariffs for goods, but also no non-tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers include things like you couldn't run an insurance company in Germany, you couldn't sell certain products in Spain. He wanted to get rid of every one of those. Margaret Thatcher hired someone called Arthur Cofield who found 287 non-tariff barriers. The problem, she was told, is that in order to get rid of those non-tariff barriers, you're going to have to ask countries who have a national veto to vote for things that aren't in their interests. So how about we get rid of the national veto and have majority voting on certain issues? She came up with the idea of, well, let's just have it for 6 months and go back to the national veto afterwards. And Delors managed to get Helmut Kohl of Germany, François Mitterrand of France, Benito Craxi of Italy, to vote her down at a European Council meeting, the first time that ever happened. And the idea is that the Single European Act in 1986-1987 included a few things, such as majority voting on things like, well, it was health and safety legislation. She spotted at the time, hold on, aren't they going to use that for bringing back some of our regulations we've just got rid of in the workplace? And she was told by civil servants, oh, no, don't worry about that. Then she saw a line, second line in the entire act, which was, we reaffirm our commitment to European Monetary Union. And she said, is this going to be the euro? Well, it wasn't the euro. Is this going to be a European currency? You said, oh, no, that's just declaratory language. The Europeans use that all the time, Prime Minister. Her people around her insist she read every single word of the act and she was happy with it. The problem is that once it was signed, countries didn't have a national veto anymore. Once it was signed, Jacques Delors found a way and a plan in that wording, we reaffirm our commitment to European Monetary Union to create what we now know as the euro. He went away, the Delors Committee was set up, took 2 years, reported back. Here's a 3-step process. European exchange rate mechanism, followed by aligning economic policy, followed by a single currency. Now, in order to do that, what he needed to do was to have another treaty, commonly known, well, as now we know it as the Maastricht Treaty, because he needed to make some changes there as well. By the time the Maastricht Treaty came into existence, Thatcher was gone, defenestrated by her own cabinet ministers because of her relationship with Europe. We'd had the Bruges speech, pro-Europe, but against the European community. Now, what happened when the Maastricht Treaty was going through? Daniel Hannan, who became someone who helped lead the Vote Leave campaign, was a student at the time. He read the first draft and said, this is enough. I'm going to dedicate my life to stopping this. More importantly with these guys are members, Conservative MPs, who during the process of the Maastricht Treaty voted against the government time and time again. They only had a majority of 21, so they were actually capable of bringing down the government. John Major was the replacement, as you'll know, and the Maastricht Treaty for these guys had, and I'm calling them guys for a reason, I will tell you their officer's name in a minute. The Maastricht Treaty had a few problems. One, it changed the name of the European Community, cooperation, to the European Union, integration. Two, it created the concept of European citizenship. Freedom of movement of workers is one thing. Citizenship means that someone from Slovenia has the same rights in Britain as they have in Slovenia, and every other Britons, and vice versa. There could be no discrimination against the workers. And three, it meant that the euro and the European currency was definitely going to be created. There was a timetable instigated. Now, most of what these guys were complaining about, there's Teddy Taylor, John Redwood, eventually there was Norman Lamont after we fell out of the exchange rate mechanism. Their problem was sovereignty. Their problem was things like You might remember Factortame, the Spanish boats, and the European Court of Justice ruling against an act of Parliament in 1988, which essentially, we made an act of Parliament to stop them locating in this country, and the European Court of Justice ruled against it. Teddy Taylor actually walked out of the chamber, said, I may as well not be here anymore, we can't make any laws. John Major in 1993 was being interviewed at the end of what turned out to be a vote of confidence in his government, which he just won. And he was asked by Michael Brunson, who was the ITV journalist, why aren't you sacking these people? And he said, well, what would you do in my position? Once people fall out of the cabinet, they can say anything. And there were 3 people in his cabinet who he was being asked whether he could sack. Do I want any more of those bastards out there? And they became known as the bastards. They called themselves the bastards. He preferred to keep them inside the tent, pissing out. What he didn't realize was that a very young Conservative was outside the tent, unzipping his flies.
Yeah, this was the real bastard of the Maastricht Treaty, Nigel Farage. And I'll just give you a quote from a speech. Ignored, neglected, those people without a voice, I am your voice. That's Donald Trump. But he was very much like Donald Trump, and his word for those people was ordinary, decent, working people. And when he became the leader of the UKIP in 2006, he made a speech in which actually, quite interesting, just looking back on it recently, he described UKIP as the new centre ground, which was something I heard last week in Brighton from Jeremy Corbyn. But back in 2006, UKIP was the new centre ground. And he said that the social democratic parties, as he described them, the Liberal Democrats, the Conservatives, and Labour, you couldn't put a cigarette paper between them. And he concluded in 2006 that there were 9 million people who didn't vote anymore, but had voted back in 1992. And he was pretty sure that these people would vote if they were asked the right question. And interestingly, on the eve of the vote in June, on the 22nd of June in 2016, he made a very similar speech in which he said, if you've never voted before, now is your opportunity to get out and vote. And that was his key message during the campaign. And when you look at the difference between the 2015 general election, where I think there was 66% turnout, and the referendum, which it was something like 72, I can't remember the exact figure. But there was a difference of 3 million people. And that difference, many believe those extra 3 million people voted Leave. And he had focused on those people. And he realized that they were out there. He held for a decade the belief that there was that group of non-voters. So I think one of Farage's key things was his belief in those non-voters. But also, obviously, he was the guy who forced the referendum, right? And I'm not going to go into that. We haven't got time to go into all of the things that he did. But the key thing for Farage is that when he stood as an MEP and formed UKIP, it was all about Maastricht. It was all about sovereignty. But it was in 2006, that same time that he made that speech, when he stood in the Bromley and Chislehurst by-election, he suddenly noticed something else was coming up on the doorstep. And he said there was a sea change. People started talking about immigration. And he retacked and rejigged his message. He hadn't mentioned immigration before. He didn't talk about it in any of his literature up until around about that time. And it was, I guess it was an opportunistic thing, really. He recognized that immigration was an issue. And for the first time in that by-election, UKIP beat Labour. And he suddenly realized as well that UKIP wasn't just for Conservatives. In fact, he could get quite a lot of blue-collar votes in the north. And so he started to focus on immigration.
On the right is Tony Blair, on the left is Gerhard Schroeder, the German Chancellor. In 2001, there were elections in both countries. Now, one of the greatest achievements of the European Union was to provide a place for the Eastern European countries to go. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there could have been chaos, like in Syria or Libya, but instead, there was actually a group of countries in the European Union who held out their arms and said, if you can become democratic, if you can sort out your economies, we can actually trade with you, come and join us. And part of that was that they were going to be welcomed, these countries, with half the GDP per capita of our countries, of most of the countries, into the European Union, and the workers were going to be able to come here. Now, Schroeder, in the German election, talked about this. In fact, Germany had a conversation, and what Schroeder put in place was some transition controls, because every country was given the option of doing that. The point is, they had a debate about it. It was in his manifesto. It wasn't mentioned at all in Labour's. Blair decided, on the basis of reports, and they still hold true, that immigration benefits the country as a whole. Blair decided not to mention it at all. And on 1st of May 2004, we opened our borders and we opened up the European Union to what one reporter told him was 13,000 workers a year. And of course, we've ended up with 3 million since that time. This is John Denham. And John Denham is really important because he's a Labour minister in the government in 2006. One of the things about not putting in transition controls when they were announced by David Blunkett, the Home Secretary, is that Blunkett said, we're going to have a workers' registration scheme. So if we have a workers' registration scheme, what we can do is we know where they are, we can make sure there's enough A&E staff, and we can make sure there's enough school places. And in 2006, 18 months later, John Denham wrote to Blair and Brown and said, I want to tell you what it's like in Southampton, Itchen. I'm not talking about the north, I'm talking about Southampton, Itchen. It's the north of Southampton. Normally when you have immigration, they go to cities and they can be easily integrated. This round of immigration, they went to market towns, they went to villages, they went to where the work was. Because many of them could work in construction, they were self-employed, they weren't on the workers' registration scheme. Denham said, I've got constituents meeting me at my surgery who are telling me their pay has dropped by 50%. We also found people in South Shields whose pay had dropped by 33%. They can't get in to see anyone in the A&E because people from these countries haven't seen a GP and don't know what it is, and so they go to the A&E with a cold. Because you don't know they're here because they're not on the workers' registration scheme, you're not providing school places for them. Can you please provide a migrant impact fund just to help them? Can you please provide some money for training British workers so that they can possibly compete against these highly efficient people? Dennis McShane, the European minister, read our book and wrote to me and said, actually, we tried to persuade Blair and Brown to do that from the start, but they wouldn't, because they said then we would be admitting there's a problem. The issue is that you weren't allowed to talk about immigration. Barbara Roche, who became immigration minister in 1999, said when she heard she was going to be promoted to the cabinet in that position, I was horrified, she said. If you talked about immigration, if you complained about your 50% cut in pay, you were called a bigot or racist. Actually, you were called a bigot if you were a 66-year-old lady in Rochdale during an election you meet Gordon Brown. The problem is when the mainstream don't talk about something, extremists take over. Now, I want to show you this. It's called the elephant curve, and it was created by an economist called Branko Milanovic in Stanford. It works like this. Along the bottom of this curve, you've got everybody lined up in terms of income per head. So the person standing number 95, he's got 95% of the world has a lower income per head than him, and 5% of the world has a higher one. You will notice here, this is a real increase in income over about a 20-year period. Now, in very, very poor countries, obviously income has grown. That's a good thing. Globalization has caused that. Chinese middle class is around here. Look at this. It's about 80%, so the 80th percentile in income. 80% of the world has income below, 20% higher. These are the working class in developed countries. Globalization, whilst having many advantages, has meant that many of their jobs have gone overseas, or people have come to their country, increase in supply of labor. Something that is good for the country as a whole might not be good for people as a whole. Try telling these people they're racist when they complain about that. Because what actually happened was that they began to realize that governments had abandoned them. These are people in seaside towns. These are people in manufacturing areas. No one was listening to them, apart from people like Nigel Farage. And in America, people like Donald Trump.
Another key factor in all of this was what I would call four crises. You've got the 2008 crisis with the guy holding his head there. You've got the Euro crisis, bottom left, with the Greeks coming up in arms. You've got the terrorism crisis, which was very prevalent on the European continent at the time of the campaign. And you've got the migrant crisis. And I just want to talk very briefly about the migrant crisis. Just the language that was used at the time of the migrant crisis by the people who would become the Remain campaigners. Let me give you a couple of quotes. The Foreign Secretary, Philip Hammond, said, "So long as there are large numbers of pretty desperate migrants marauding around the area, there'll always be a threat to tunnel security." The Labour politicians accused him of being alarmist and dehumanising. Theresa May said that Europe needed to get on with the job of breaking the link between economic migrants making the dangerous journey across the Mediterranean and settling in Europe. Most of those migrants weren't economic migrants, in fact. David Cameron spoke of a swarm of people coming across the Mediterranean seeking a better life, and he was told not to treat people or talk about them as if they were insects. And I just mention that language because obviously in the last week of the campaign there was the famous Breaking Point poster. And a lot of people say, oh, that was horrific from what Nigel Farage did, the way that he portrayed migrants and the threat. I don't personally see any difference in the language that he was using in that poster to the language of the people that were actually campaigning against him. And Dominic Cummings says that those images, combined with statesmen like our Prime Minister coming on and saying those kind of things, was worth millions in advertising for Vote Leave. I think it's a very interesting point. I'm not sure it's true, but I do think it was an impact. The Euro crisis and the financial crisis had another impact, which was illustrated rather well by Michael Gove on Sky News when he spoke to Faisal Islam. He said that people have had enough of experts. He was spot on. All the surveys suggested that people actually didn't believe in experts anymore. The thing in one survey that people trusted in most was their own common sense. The document of 2014 I mentioned makes this point. The motives of big business are very suspect. People think of them as speaking for their own corporate interests, not in the national interests. It's far from obvious that having Goldman Sachs on the side of in would be an advantage. How prophetic was that? And the problem that the problem that the Remain camp had in the end was that they had Project Fear. And Project Fear was essentially an idea of that was backed up by experts. You know, it was financial business leaders, the government machine, and because of those crises, and particularly the financial crisis and the Euros crisis, they were damaged goods. The other thing that was damaged, and we're just coming on to the kind of last thing that we're going to talk about, is the other thing that was damaged was the Labour Party in many people's eyes. Many people felt that the Labour Party, and particularly Jeremy Corbyn, was detrimental to the campaign, to the Remain campaign, and there he is at the launch of the Labour in bus. It was raining that day. I was there, and I remember interviewing him afterwards. It was interesting because he made a speech after lots of other people, and it was all of his notes were getting rather damp and wet. And he referred to them constantly through this bit, like I am now, I'm afraid. But he referred to his notes constantly. Now, if you've ever seen him speak on the stage or in Brighton like he did earlier last week, he's very, very authoritative. He actually speaks very well as a campaigner. But when he was campaigning for Remain, he didn't. He was quite unconvincing. And people tend to think that he was... well, we described him in the book as Agent Corbyn, actually working for the other side, actually potentially wanted to leave after all. I'm not convinced by this argument. And I'm going to suggest that he was actually overstated as a factor in all of this. You've got to remember that Labour was, sure he made mistakes, and sure there were things, it was a very chaotic campaign that they ran. It didn't work very well with the rest of the stronger in. But there were reasons for that. And one of them was that they had the May elections during the campaign. And in the May elections, a lot of the actual Labour campaigners who were MPs noticed that there was quite a hostility towards Labour's stance on the doorstep. And I met quite a few Labour MPs who actually said, well, I might not actually go out and campaign too much, simply because I don't want to remind people when the referendum is, because I know they're going to vote leave. And they were quite damaged by the Scottish referendum. The big message for Labour after the Scottish referendum was don't share a platform with the Tories, because they obviously saw what happened. The SNP came through and pretty much wiped out Labour after the referendum in Scotland. So it wasn't, in my view, just Jeremy Corbyn that was the problem. I think the other thing, what I would just add to that, is that, I mean, I went up to sort of working class communities in Worksop and places like that, and I remember going to meet John Mann, the MP for Bassett Law, and he was at a bingo hall, and I did a straw poll of everyone in that bingo pool, and 90% of them voted leave. And he basically said that it wasn't to do with the campaigns, it wasn't Boris Johnson, it wasn't Jeremy Corbyn, it wasn't Nigel Farage. It was a decision, it was a community decision. People had looked at their own circumstances, a bit like the thing that Paul was referring to, and they'd made their decision based on that. And if you combine that with what we were saying about people having enough of experts, I'm just not quite convinced that a Tony Blair-style character running a campaign wouldn't have fallen into the category that would have been dismissed. And after all, you have to remember that the reason they didn't have a Blairite in the Labour Party was because Jeremy Corbyn had won. His form of politics was taking over. So the circumstance itself suggests that perhaps a Blairite influence over Labour voters was lessening anyway. So I'm going to say, after all that Jeremy Corbyn is probably the most overstated factor in the reason why we lost, or why the Remain campaign lost the referendum.
And this is the most understated factor, a man called Steve Baker. He's the MP for High Wycombe, devoted Christian. When he came into Parliament in 2010, he came in with an interestingly detailed understanding of the political system. He formed a group called Room Art, where they met in Portcullis House every Tuesday at 8:30. They looked at the parliamentary programme. They worked out what committees to get on. They worked out what they could do to amend bills to try and get a referendum. When they got the referendum, when David Cameron announced it in his Bloomberg speech in 2013, they made sure that when the referendum happened, they would make sure that how it was set up was as balanced as possible. And Steve Baker was the reason that happened, because he did a few things. The first one was a rule called purdah. Purdah is the last month or 6 weeks of a campaign. It's when no government reports are allowed to be sent out. So the reason why there weren't any government reports sent out in the last month after the immigration figures came out, that said 330,000 people had moved, is because back in June 2015, when the referendum bill was launched in the second reading, Steve Baker found in the explanatory notes, right at the end, the following words. For the purposes of this referendum, Section 125 of the Political Parties, Elections and Referendum Act will be set aside. Section 125 is purdah. They tried to take away purdah, this time when the government could have supported the Remain campaign, and he spotted it, and he got it put back in. The second thing was the question. The question was originally going to be, should Britain remain in the EU, yes or no? Steve Baker found Guardian figures that found that if you change the question from should Britain remain yes or no to should Britain remain in the European Union or leave with the votes remain or leave, it would make 4% difference. 4%. 52 to 48. This is what British people have never quite understood in terms of importance. On the right-hand side is Helmut Kohl, the German Chancellor. On the left-hand side is François Mitterrand. He was French president. It's 1984 at Verdun. And in Verdun, they are commemorating a battle in 1914 between France and Germany. This isn't a setup. This is 40 years of peace between two countries. So music started playing, and for some reason, neither of them quite understand. They started holding hands. Margaret Thatcher looked at this picture because some of her staff were really moved by it. And they said, "What do you think? Isn't it amazing?" She said, "Oh, no, it's two old men holding hands." What she didn't understand is how much this peace has meant to the continent, what the European Union has done. And we made fun of David Cameron in a way when he said to, Faisal Islam said to David Cameron, "What comes first, economic meltdown or World War III?" Because he'd made a speech about this, is how much the European Union means to our continental cousins. It's a political movement, not just economic. And the truth is that because we weren't there to shape the EU in our interests when we joined, because we had to contort ourselves economically and politically when we did join, and because no one, not Tony Blair, not Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair used to come back from, and he's very pro-EU, Tony Blair used to come back from signing treaties. Instead of talking about the amazing achievement of integrating Eastern Europe, he'd say, "Oh, I got an opt-out from this, I got an opt-out from that." No one sold it and explained it to the British people. When I got to the end of the history, I realized that the Remain campaign did pretty well to get 30%, let alone 48%. Because the truth is, history put a gun to David Cameron's head, and it had live bullets in. And for some reason, he chose to pull the trigger. And here we are. Thank you very much. Now, thank you. Thank you. Our trusty assistant has a microphone. Does anybody have any questions they want to ask? Please do. Yes.
We know that Linton Crosby had suggested to him that it would be a bad idea to hold the referendum when he did. We know that he went early in holding the referendum in the first place because the 2015 manifesto had said there'd be the manifesto by 2017. People have speculated that it was hubris, that he'd won the election in 2015 and he hadn't expected to, but that either way, you don't cross the road if there's a fire engine coming down the road at speed. And if what you say is true, is that the Remains were always going to lose, why did he do it?
Well, it's a good question. I think when you come to why did he do it so quickly after 2015 is because he committed to it in his manifesto. And that was actually one of the great achievements of Douglas Carswell. Because after the Bloomberg speech, a lot of people, everybody knows about the Bloomberg speech. He made the speech in 2013. He was under a lot of pressure to make it. There had been various, there'd been a vote in Parliament, basically, in which he'd had a massive rebellion against him. And we could go back to how that came about. But in answer to your question, I think a lot of people thought after the Bloomberg speech, a lot of Eurosceptics thought that he wasn't going to see it through. And so they started to put pressure on him. So one of the things that Tory MPs started to do was join UKIP. So you had, the first one obviously was Douglas Carswell. And then you had Mark Reckless, who made that kind of massive statement joining UKIP at the conference in Torquay. I was there, I remember. And that was very, very well kept secret. Sort of nobody in the room knew. And I was having this text from the press officer saying, come on, are you honest? So basically they wanted Sky News to be on them live. And I said, no, because nothing's happening. I said, can you get honest? And I said, well, not unless you tell us what's going to happen. And then I said, okay. So I called the desk and said, okay, come to the UKIP conference. I mean, nothing much is happening, but something's about to happen. And we did. And the great thing was that the BBC were on the Victoria Derbyshire show or something. They couldn't cut across to it, so it was just on Sky News. And Cameron felt the pressure of that. And so he thought, well, what can I do? And he put in his manifesto, well, I will make sure that within the first 100 days the legislation goes through. So it was just simply applying pressure. We can talk about all the, I mean, there's a whole chapter called the Crowbar Referendum, which is basically the whole issue around why at that moment the pressure was on Cameron to do it. And I mean, he might have also thought there was justification for doing it as well. There was this sort of democratic deficit argument that he put across, that people hadn't had a vote on Lisbon. He'd said there was going to be a vote on Lisbon. He'd had to backtrack on that. For God's sake, people might start to actually think that he wasn't a little bit Eurosceptic. They might start to think that he was pro-Europe. You're not going to get away with that as leader of the Conservative Party. So he was worried about his position, and I think that's why he did it.
Also, I don't think there were many people from Worksop in his advisory team. I'm not sure he knew what would happen. I don't think he had the data. I think he told the European...
He thought he was going to win, yeah.
Yeah, he told the European leaders, don't worry, I've got this. Was that his word?
Yeah, he did, yeah.
Next question, just behind you.
I'm a bit surprised that he thought he was going to win, because there is quite a substantial literature from academics that have studied how the media have covered Europe throughout a long time. And the BBC is one of them, who have used very heavy negative frames. So clearly the mind of the voters have been brainwashed over decades that Europe wasn't a positive place to be, and that the Commonwealth was a much stronger idea for the British people. I'm asking how politicians don't get information from very literature that is out there, is easy to consult, and obviously would have been quite a good idea in this case.
Yeah, I mean, started by Boris Johnson as the Telegraph's Brussels correspondent, who realised that you don't get articles on the front page unless you come up with some really crazy stuff. And so all those stories about bendy bananas and vacuum cleaners suction and stuff like that started it. And you're right, there's a long history, and there's been studies done in it, and we talk about it in the book, the studies that were done showing the positive stroke negative media. And it's clear that if you go through the articles, most stuff about Europe is negative in the press. But you look at, like, if you, for example, you take 2014 when UKIP won the European referendum, the vote on places for MEPs, and they won that. You'd think, well, that's a warning right there that people are Eurosceptic. They want to leave the EU. But actually, if you combine Labour and Conservative votes together and the Liberal Democrats, even then, you'd look at it and go, actually, no, they only got 20% of the vote, we're okay. You know, I think probably there's this Eurosceptic swell, but it's not big enough. And also, he had a huge confidence around, he just won the Scottish referendum. He shouldn't have had that confidence, because actually, they'd started with a 10-point lead, and I think it had gone down to a 5-point lead. So they actually lost their lead over during the course of the Scottish referendum. But they had this absolute belief that British public would support the status quo, that we're risk averse. And actually, it's quite funny. I'm not name dropping here, but I had dinner with Andrea Leadsom night before last, and she was saying that people who voted Remain are definitely more likely to be risk averse. And there's this feeling, I think, amongst the main politicians at the time that all we have to do is worry people about the dangers of leaving. And you're right, they underestimated the power of the newspapers, but also they also failed to recognize that a newspaper like the Telegraph, who had for 20 years basically had the drumbeat of how bad the European Union is, couldn't then suddenly turn around and support remaining in. So they were always going to have the newspapers against them. The reason they couldn't do that is the readers wouldn't accept it, because they've been told for 20 years it's a bad idea.
Just while Rebecca's walking up, James McGrory, who was in the Remain campaign, told us about some focus groups that were about December or November of 2015, in which he was trying to speak to Remain voters to find out some messages in favour of the EU, and they didn't know anybody. They didn't know any of them. What they did know was why we should leave the EU. And that's when the Remain campaign realised they just had to go with Project Fear. That's all they had.
They could literally say, you know, oh, there's lots of people coming here. We get all these rules that we don't really understand, and oh, it's quite expensive, isn't it? Those three things, three core things of the Leave campaign. People knew that off pat before the campaign even started.
I was going to say over 70% of the over 50s went out to vote and only 40% of the under 30s. If the young vote had got out of bed that day, would that have changed the result?
Well, that's maybe the one thing you could throw at Jeremy Corbyn. We were talking about this, weren't we? I mean, he would have had to have got over how many?
He would have had to get 1.2 million voters because he wasn't going to change the minds. Most Labour Leave voters had decided to vote Leave a long time before Jeremy Corbyn came in. So it would have had to get 1.2 million people to vote Remain. And yes, as was then showed in this current election, it is possible. There was, in the 2017 election, one has to remember, it was June the 8th. A lot of young people were still at university, but no exams. And Momentum understood that and managed to get them to the polling station. But they'd also learned from the EU referendum what happens if you don't vote. Politics happens to you. And we'll never know now what happens. There is an assumption that more young people have voted. They might have all voted Remain. But sadly, that didn't happen, and that's kind of their choice.
Yeah, can't add to that. Yeah, but it's their choice, isn't it? That's where we live in a democracy. I mean, you're right. And there's this feeling now amongst the camps that basically the Remain camp is waiting for the Leave camp to die. Basically, if we can hold on long enough, you know, and put things back and have a hugely long transition period and have another referendum, then some of the people who voted Leave will have died. And some of the people who would have liked to have voted Remain will realise that actually if they want to remain, they have to actually go and put the cross in the box.
Thank you. This is a question for Jason, really. Paul clearly believes that the long-term factors were decisive. Despite putting the case for the short-term factors, do you actually agree with him?
Yes. I do, actually. Well, I mean, I think there are definitely things that went wrong in the campaign for the Remain camp. There were definitely things which I think I've demonstrated the Leave camp were more on it. One of the reasons they were more on it is because they've been going at it for long term because of all of the things that Paul discussed. So it sort of made me realize, writing this book with Paul, that you know, history is so important to understanding what's going on now. And, you know, we have given this book to the Chancellor. We've given it to David Davis. They get free copies. And I gave it to David Davis. Now, I saw him reading it, so I know he's reading it. And I do think there are lessons in there about this idea, for example, of going back to a free trading agreement that was sort of like put forward as the time gone by that we used to have that we never did have. And Paul discovered this idea that we had tried that with Plan G, which was in the 50s, and it didn't work. And there's reasons why it didn't work. And we explore why it doesn't work. And there are things that you can look at now and go, yeah, history played a massive part. And I don't think either campaign really understood the significance of it. And it does make me laugh that, you know, what was actually a revolt against Westminster is now often recorded in the history books, not ours, but in many of the history books, as the machinations and the playings and the workings of a few people in Westminster. It was a revolt against you guys in Westminster, and yet they're taking responsibility for it. So I think that's an irony, and I think probably he was right.
To give you an example, Jason was at a meeting in Newcastle, and it was a hustings, and a Remain voting MEP stood up and talked about the loss of GDP, and someone in the audience in Newcastle said, GDP, That's your GDP. We don't have GDP in Newcastle. The economy to people around the country is their school, their hospital. GDP is a Westminster thing. And was a revolt. I do note also from writing this book with Jason that whereas we started out with this idea, and we still agree it's a unique constellation of factors that may never happen again and probably hadn't happened before. Certainly it took, I think it was on your final reading of the book when you actually said, you know what, actually we should, what probably was history. You can still make up your mind having read the book. We've come to a conclusion we felt we needed to, but you might think differently.
You have conducted the Remain campaign and perhaps overturn history.
Do you want me to answer that?
Why are you giving it to me?
I think, okay, I wouldn't have gone for 4,300. I would have gone for £80 a week. You'll be £80 a week worse off. I actually think I would have gone Project Fear, but I would have gone. This is the. So having said that, you know, Project Fear didn't necessarily work, I think sometimes it was a bit shrill, and they shouldn't have had Obama say, "Get to the back of the queue." I think that wound people up. But if he'd have come over and said, "Look, guys, this might not be good. You know, I can't guarantee a trade deal, and of course I'm going to deal with Europe first." I think then I would have focused on the positives. I would have said, these guys are saying we can do trade deals around the world with China. What about the fact that we've got really... Sorry? Yeah, so I would have said, look, they're saying we can do trade deals with China. What about the really wealthy countries that we live next door to, who we know about, who we've been trading with for 30 years? What's wrong with trading with Germany? It's a really wealthy country, it's really close, doesn't have a human rights problem. France, even closer. You know, I would have said those kind of things, because I don't think you can sell that to Britain. It's not in our history. It is in theirs. You can. I mean, I spoke to a lot of Europeans, and they would always say world peace is that's why we have the European Union. But you don't hear that in the UK. It's a trade thing. Okay, it's a trade thing. Fine. Okay, we give up some sovereignty, but we still have control of our NHS. We still have control of our armed forces. We still set a budget every year. You could basically knock down those arguments. So I just think that the positive argument, along with Project Fear, I wouldn't have got rid of Project Fear. I just would have done it. Dominic Cummings, I don't know if anyone's seen Spinal Tap, but Spinal Tap, the band, has an amplifier, and the amplifier has an number 11 on it to make it louder. And Dominic Cummings said they were always putting it on 11. And the reason they were always putting it on 11 because they were trying to get stories in the news. So they've got to have a story on the news at 6 tonight, you know. But actually, sometimes you didn't have to be quite as shrill.
Matthew Elliott said, and he was the chief executive of the Leave campaign, he was asked, how would you have changed the Remain campaign? He gave the example of the 350 million bus. He said, I would have said, had I heard about this 350 million to the NHS, said, you know what, we do send some amount of money to Europe, that's right. We're not going to argue with that. We get about 10 times back in benefits. It's like a gym membership, and we get all this back in benefits. And here are the benefits, this, and this. Instead, they complained about the numbers, said it was a lie, and he started to find that Remain voters were saying, oh, I'm voting Leave because Leave voters were saying, I wasn't going to vote Leave, and then the Remain campaign told me that you're sending 350 million to the NHS. So there were some tactical errors. I still think it would have been hard.
Okay, last question now.
So I'm not so sure in the end whether you think it was inevitable or it was you can blame people for doing it the wrong way. If you were insisting on the claim that it was inevitable because of the burden of the history, the way the UK joined the mechanism, the reluctance, all of that, then all what you'll be saying is that, of course, the relationship with Britain to the EU is not the same as France and Germany. If there is a referendum there, it's less likely to win than in the UK, that's for sure. But that is not enough of an argument to show that it was inevitable. So of course, the voting for somebody like Trump in the US is more likely for a country in the US than the UK, let alone Norway. but doesn't mean that the victory of the Trump was inevitable. So I think to engage.
I don't think we're saying it's inevitable.
Yeah.
I think what we're saying is I was saying history is a bigger factor than the campaign.
Sure, that's.
I mean, I know you might be saying it's inevitable.
No, I'm not saying it's inevitable. I'm going to answer your question, which is that Britain, of all countries, the only country that entered Europe out of weakness. Everybody else entered for positive reasons. In the 70s, we were becoming an economic basket case. So we entered. We are slightly different. We're an island as well. We, for instance, until the 1900s, we didn't even have to have an army because it was all the Navy and things like that. We didn't have an RAF, obviously. I wouldn't say it was necessarily inevitable, but what I am saying is that, and the campaign still, and as you read about it, and Jason analyzes each aspect of the campaign and uses the history that I wrote in weaving into it, is that there were lots of things that made it harder for the Remain campaign. I don't think anything's inevitable because something could have happened. But what happened was it became so much harder to explain why we should be in the EU. I know this is slightly controversial, but people say that Leave vote was about ignorance. The people who know least about what they voted for, in terms of who I spoke to, were Remain voters, because they don't know what the EU is, they don't know how laws are made. That doesn't mean they're ignorant, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it's quite difficult, therefore, when even people who are really sure they want to vote for the EU aren't really understanding what they're voting for, to explain why it's so important. I don't think anything is inevitable necessarily, but it's a lot more understandable. I don't want people, we're neutral on Brexit. We don't want people to change their mind or anything like that. We want them to understand why it happened. We've tried to write something that in 30 years' time will still be relevant. It ends on June 24th, 2016. Will still be relevant in explaining why this enormous political earthquake happened. And still you'll be able to make up your own mind having read about it. So yes, nothing much is inevitable apart from us being in room 4 at the end of this talk signing books if you wish to get if you get one with £2.50 going to the Latymer Foundation. So room 4 is just at the back. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. I just want to say one last thing. Another reason why I'm here is because Latymer Upper School as a whole in its strategy puts scholarliness of their teachers up as a very, very important thing. And they didn't just say that, they gave us some free periods every week in our timetable. They really properly invested in it. And that's another reason why I'm here. And so I'm very grateful also to the school, and in particular to Rebecca, who heard about my book. And this is Rebecca Moles from the Latymer Foundation. She's heard about my book. She came up with an idea of an event to launch it and talk about it. And most of all, I'm grateful for you for taking time to come and see us. So thank you very much to you.